Welcome back to another episode of the IFC's Individuation podcast. I am Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai, and today with me, as always, the Chain Gang with Lisa Hung. Dr. Lisa Hung is with us, and Dr. Eric Tomlinson is with us.
Greetings.
He is currently furloughed on the Chain Gang. Welcome back, Dr. Eric. Okay, so today we're going to cover Mary Louise von Franz's volume 2 of Archetypal Stories and Fairy Tales, The Hero's Journey. So today we're going to dive into The Poor Miller's Boy and the Cat. And this is Grimm's Brother tale. So without further ado, Lisa, you want to start reading?
Sure. It's the first story in chapter 2, written by the Grimm's brothers, The Poor Miller's Boy and the Cat. In a certain mill lived an old miller who had neither wife nor child, but 3 apprentices who served under him. As they had been with him for many years, he said to them one day, "I'm old and I want to sit in the chimney corner. Go out, and whosoever of you brings me the best horse home, to him I will give the mill. And in return for it, he shall take care of me until my death." The third of the boys was, however, the dunce, who was looked on as foolish by the others, and they called him Stupid Hans. They begrudged the mill to him, and after all, he was not even interested and most likely did not even want it. Then all 3 went out together, and when they came to the village, the 2 said to Stupid Hans, "You may just as well stay here. As long as you live, you will never get a horse." Hans went with him, however, and when it was night, they came to a cave in which they lay down to sleep. The 2 sharp ones waited until Hans fell asleep, and they got up and went away, leaving him where he was. And they thought they had done a very clever thing, but it was certain to return out ill for them. When the sun rose and Hans woke up, he was lying in a deep cavern. He clambered out of the cave, went into the forest, and thought, "Here I am, quite alone and deserted. How shall I obtain a horse now?" Whilst he was thus walking full of thoughts, he met a small tabby cat that said, "Hans, what are you doing?" "Alas, thou cannot help me." "I know your desire," said the cat. "You wish to have a beautiful horse. Come with me and be my faithful servant for 7 years long, and then I will give you one more beautiful than any you had ever seen in your whole life." So she took him with her into her enchanted castle, where there were nothing but cats that were her servants. They leapt nimbly upstairs and downstairs and were merry and happy. In the evening, when they sat down to dinner, 3 of them had to make music. One played the bassoon, the other the fiddle, and the third put the trumpet to his lips and blew out his cheeks as much as he possibly could. When they had dined, the table was carried away, and the cat said, "Now, Hans, come and dance with me." "No," said he, "I won't dance with a pussy cat. I have never done that yet." "Then take him to bed," she said to the cats. So one of them lighted him to his bedroom. One pulled off his shoes, one his stockings, and the last one of them blew out the candle. The next morning, they returned and helped him out of bed. One put his stockings on for him, one tied his garters, and one brought his shoe. One washed him, and one dried his face with her tail. He had to serve the cat, however, and chop some wood every day, and to do that, he had an axe of silver, and the wedge and saw were of silver, and the mallet of copper. So he chopped the wood into small pieces, stayed there in the house, and had good meat and drink, but never saw anyone but the tabby cat and her servants. Once she said to him, "Go and mow my meadows and dry the grass," and gave him a scythe of silver and whetstone of gold, but bade him deliver them carefully. Hans went thither and did what he was bidden, and when he had finished the work, he carried the scythe, the whetstone, and the hay to the house, and asked if it was not yet time for her to give him his reward. "No," said the cat, "you must first do something more for me of the same kind. There is timber of silver, a carpenter's axe, square, and everything that is needful, all of silver. With these, build me a small house." Then Hans built the small house. The 7 years went by as if they were 6 months. The cat asked him if he would like to see her horses, and she opened the door of the small house, and there stood 12 horses. Such horses, so bright and shining that his heart rejoiced at sight of them. And now she gave him to eat and drink, and said, "Go home. I will not give thee thy horse away with thee, but in 3 days' time I will follow thee and bring it." So Hans set out, and she showed him the way to the mill. She had never once given him a new coat, however, and he had been obliged to keep on his dirty old smock frock, which he had brought with him, and which during the 7 years had become too small for him. In the meantime, the old miller boys had brought home a blind horse and a lame one. They laughed at Hans and did not believe that his horse would follow in 3 days. The old miller sent him away from the table because of his torn clothes, and he had to sleep in the goose house. In the morning when he awoke, the 3 days had passed, and a coach came with 6 horses, and they shone so brightly that it was delightful to see them. A servant brought a 7th as well, which was for the poor miller's boy. And a magnificent princess alighted from the coach and went to the mill, and the princess was a little tabby cat whom poor Hans had served for 7 years. She asked the miller where the miller's boy and dunce was. Then the miller said, "We cannot have him here in the mill, for he is so ragged. He is lying in the goose house." Then the king's daughter said that they were to bring him immediately. So they brought him out, and he had to hold his little smock frock together to cover himself. The servants unpacked splendid garments and washed him and dressed him. And when that was done, no king could have looked more handsome. Then the maiden desired to see the horses, which the other apprentices had brought home with them, and one of them was blind and the other lame. Then she ordered the servant to bring the 7th horse, and when the miller saw it, he said that such a horse as that had never yet entered his yard. "And that is for the 3rd miller's boy," said she. "That he must have the mill," said the miller. But the king's daughter said that the horse was there, and that he was to keep his mill as well, and took her faithful Hans and set him in the coach and drove away with him. They first drove to the little house which she had built with the silver tools, and behold, it was a great castle, and everything inside of it was of silver and gold. And then she married him, and he was rich, so rich that he had enough for all the rest of his life. After this, let no one ever say that anyone who is silly can never become a person of importance.
Okay. So Stupid Hans was not that stupid. This is similar to the 3 feathers, the story of the 3 feathers, and how the 3 boys want to go out and compete to get the father's kingdom. So in this case, instead of there's toads, there's pussycats. It's a very similar story. What do we realize from the story? What is there to understand? Well, one of them is don't underestimate anybody. Their appearance is not who they are. So the way they appear and the way they seem is an illusion, right? Because nobody understood Hans in this case. They underestimated him, and it cost them to underestimate him. Second is the transformational aspect of the story. Hans is transformed in ways that he doesn't understand. And he still goes back to talk about finishing his task. And the other 2 boys brought in, this is also a good segue to the 3 little pigs. So there were 3 little pigs, and one built his house out of straw, one built his house out of wood, and one built his house out of stone. Guess who survived? So They didn't live in an earthquake zone. Just to make sure that you did. Because if you didn't know, then the pig who built with stone would not survive. It would be the straw. But they didn't build there anyway. Anyway, the story is about transformation. The story is about becoming more conscious. How is it that we as individuals gain consciousness? What is consciousness? How do we go obtaining it? Do we go to the fruit market of consciousness and there's a grapefruit that gives us a bittersweet consciousness? How is it that we gain consciousness if it's not at the fruit market? Where do we get it from? So our everyday interaction with creatures, small and large, gives us a way to view consciousness. The consciousness that the cat always looks up at the human being, and the human is always looking down at the cat. So the consciousness of the person looking down and the person looking up are two different forms of consciousness. You are not aware of how people are looking down. You're aware of how you're looking up. That's called consciousness. So, what do you think of the story so far, Lisa? Do you find it that little Hans was, or stupid Hans was not fully awake, fully conscious? Is this part of his transformational journey into consciousness? What do you think? What are your thoughts about stupid Hans?
Like you said, is similar to the three feathers, where he seems ignorance of his ignorance almost. And although he was asked to do a great many tasks, I think 3 of them, he didn't worry about if he was able to succeed. He just did. These are some parallels I see remarkable about the underdog.
I liked what you said about he was not conscious of his ignorance. His ignorance was not conscious of his ignorance. So when you're ignorant in that way, you end up doing all the tasks without worrying about procedure.
Mm-hmm.
So it can look chaotic, but it can still get done. There's a freedom in ignorance. When we're too conscious of ourselves and who we are, we get distracted. It's like Narcissus when he's staring in the pond and seeing his reflection, that he was so beautiful that he fell in love with himself, fell into the pond and died. But every day Narcissus would go and walk to the pond and stare at his face. So if he was more ignorant of the way he looked, or if he was more ignorant of his need for self-love, if he was more ignorant of that, then he would be able to survive longer. Because in this case, Narcissus's possession ends up killing him, or what he thinks he needs to possess, or what he thinks he possesses. Well, stupid Hans doesn't really possess anything. He, as Lisa said, he's ignorant of his own ignorance. Dr. Eric, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the reasons, there could be multiple reasons, of course, but one of the reasons he was ignorant of his innocence, and I completely agree with you that he was, is that he was young. we find out later that he outgrew in 7 years, he outgrew his frock.
Good
So,
point.
and he, and when he had the opportunity to dance with the cat, he was too sheltered and afraid to do that. It was too much for him. I looked up the meaning of these instruments because I didn't quite understand why these three were used together. The bassoon is represents an attitude of versatility. The fiddle represents joy and spiritual sexuality, not just sexuality, but spiritual sexuality, which is much more connecting and meaningful. And then the trumpet, one of authority. So he had all of this music from these three different elements hitting him, and yet he was scared. He was too scared to go. He was so scared that to dance with the cat that they put him to bed. He was overwhelmed. So clearly,
So it wasn't a jazz band. I thought they were forming a jazz band.
not with the fiddle.
I thought it was a jazz quartet or something.
Nah.
It was missing the singer. Just kidding. Okay. Good
So
point. I think it's a good point. Go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
Well, and then as he matures, as he grows up, and she puts him to work. I mean, yes, she gave him the finest of tools, but he had to work. I've worked in hay fields before, and she said, you not only need to cut my meadows, you need to dry it out too. And a lot of people may not know because they haven't worked in it, but when you cut hay, this grass is 3 feet tall. It's not like mowing a yard. And then you have to spend the next 3 or 4 days raking that cut grass underneath the sun so that it dries out. Because if you bale it up with it wet, it burns up and catches fire in your barn and burns your barn down because of the heat that's generated from the fermentation of green grass. So she worked his butt off, and he became someone that was used to toil and labor, and did it in a way where he said the 7 years seemed like but 6 months. So he was enjoying his growing up. I found that very interesting. He got pleasure out of his growing up and maturing and becoming a young man.
So symbolically, the representation of him maturing into early adulthood, I'm guessing,
Yes.
because she comes back to marry him. So he was probably a child when he arrived. And this must have been his adolescence, right? Dancing with the pussycat, working in the field, toiling with the hay. Interesting points you make about what happens with hay if you prematurely put it together. So these are all transformational processes.
Yes.
This is what we call alchemical, right? This is how something is transformed from one form of matter to another. And there's transformation all the way throughout the story. As he transforms into a young adult, the field is transformed because he worked on it. His attitude transforms because of the dance and the music, and what the music and the dance implies. And then his transformation takes another step where he starts to she acknowledges his transformative his ego, where he is given luxuries such as silver and gold, but they're also transformational objects because you're rich beyond your wildest dreams. And usually what that means is, or you live happily ever after. And those two things imply that you have been transformed. You're one with the self. And so your riches are beyond comprehension, because the richness of connecting to your deeper self. So I know
that was really nicely summarized, Dr. Lahab. Thank you.
Yeah, but you know, in a lot of ways, people try to gain wealth and believe that the acquiring of wealth without any other thing to do except acquire wealth leads to some form of happiness, that wealth provides happiness in that way, and it doesn't. A certain amount of wealth does provide relief and food and the ability to be happy, but it does not ultimately take the place of what is required.
Can I make one quick point about the wealth
Yeah.
aspect?
Yeah, go for it.
I found it fascinating that she taught him one of the greatest lessons that many people who grow and become successful and acquire things and wealth, she taught him a lesson that is very difficult to learn. And that is, think about all of the tools that she gave him. She was giving him riches in the context of his work, the axe, you know, all the different tools, whether they were made out of copper, silver, or gold, in either building the house or doing his toil. And he was using the riches that he was given to produce something, to have an effect, to work, to have an effect on something other than just enjoying the pleasures of those riches. And I thought that was an incredible lesson that she taught him.
So the lesson of creation provides us with wealth. When we create, when we write, when we produce, when we figure out, when we do something with our existence, that provides a form of treasure for us. It also gives us consciousness, which is the earlier point that we were trying to make. This is a road to consciousness, and every part of the road has a different lesson to teach. And the lessons of the road and the lessons of the fairy tale are always keep your eyes open. Understand the lessons that you have to learn, because one day those lessons will be required for you. So everything that you learn down the road, everything that you learn in school, everything that you learn on the streets, everything you learn from the playground, everything you learn from your travels, all of those are creations. That learning, that consciousness is required for a bigger task. So every smaller task that is done, finished, or accomplished is in itself not finished, not accomplished, and not whole. It is a piece, a part of a larger, more complicated story that we weave. So each piece of the journey that we gain more consciousness and more clarity of our road, the more that the transformation takes place. Because we actually, along the road, when you start out on the road, the road looks really long, like it's never going to end. And then as you come up towards the first part of the road, you're like, oh, I didn't know I could go this far. And that is the sentiment that you will repeat over and over again through your lifetime. Oh, I didn't know I could go this far. And when there are stumbles, hurricanes and tornadoes, natural disasters and man-made disasters, then what happens is that trauma interferes on the road. And so you start to notice that you're not actually moving anymore, that you're stuck somewhere down the road. And that's because the trauma is sitting there and you're fighting it out internally to try to resolve the trauma that happened externally. But now is a part of an internal process that's not going away. So for him to grow, for him to be free, the first part of the road is being released from the tyrant. The tyrant is, in this case, the man who wants him to go get him a horse and take care of him for the rest of his life. And that's the tyrant, right? So it's the shadow of the king. It's the shadow of the father. So that's where the hero starts out, living in the shadow of the father, living under the rules of the father, which is the best you could do is you inherit my wealth and you inherit me. So you really don't inherit my wealth because that requires sacrifice. That requires giving without exception. And when we can't give without exception, that's how we become a tyrant. We can't give it. There's always a but in the giving. So he wants a horse and he wants his apprentices to take care of him. And if they can't take care of him, then he will not give them the mill. So he had to break free from the tyrant father. The hero's journey begins. And then he had to deal with the mystical, magical elements in the world. And the mystical and magical elements in the world that face us, whether in a field, whether in the city, whether in the country, whether on a mountain, whether in the desert, what faces us is something mystical, magical that needs our attention. So it grabs our attention. And in this case, it's housed in this cat or a pussycat. It holds the magical attention. Understanding the cat, we understand life. Understand the instinctual in this case. Cats are very instinctual. They're territorial. They're identified with self-sufficiency, which is nothing that stupid Hans had. And needed for his consciousness, his growth. And then we add the musical instruments. So the fiddle represented what, Dr. Eric?
Joy and spiritual sexuality.
And what did the bassoon represent?
The bassoon was versatility.
And what did the trumpet represent?
authority. And of course, modern day, our modern day world has turned that into a warlike symbol.
Mhm. But authority and versatility and
Authority.
and sexual spirituality, these
Yeah.
are all part of becoming whole, becoming one, individuating, finding self, finding consciousness. So every time we find consciousness, then we're rewarded with the treasure of gold. Gold is what the alchemists tried to produce, represents the Philosopher's Stone. They were trying to produce gold, and they were trying to use the gold to infect other material and turn that material into gold. And the way that process occurs is that you think about it, if you become conscious, if you find gold, then you reach out to people around you and you try to pull them in and make them conscious. Because what you're doing is you're sharing your wealth. And that's what treatment is. Good treatment is sharing wealth. If you've been in good treatment, if you've been with a good therapist, if you have a good trauma specialist, if you've been treated well, if you have found solutions to problems, if you had symptoms being relieved, then you want to share that.
That's a great point. That's a great point, Dr. Lahab. Thank you.
That's gold, right? So this is why, we want to share this gold with you. We want to share gold. We want to share help. And the gold that you're infected by infects others around you and turns them into gold. So what the Philosopher's Stone is the material that turns into gold. It's that special material that you add to turn whatever material you have, and usually it was lead, try to add to it, to change it, to transform it into gold. And that was the Philosopher's Stone. That was the key ingredient in the transformative process. We call it the Philosopher's Stone. So, any thoughts?
Just in line with what you're saying, I've always enjoyed the use of numbers, especially in religious writings. I'm now finding that they're in all the fairy tales, which I didn't know. But
in your dreams.
Yeah, very much so. But even among many world religions, the number 7 is one of completion or perfection. The number, and so he had to work for her for 7 years. And then when it was all over with, he had to wait 3 days. And 3 days, and again, multiple religious writings represents harmony, wisdom, and understanding. So it's like you got to do your 7 years of work. And again, 7 can represent a number of different things, but you have to put in your work before the wisdom and harmony and understanding comes your way. So I always notice when those 2 numbers especially are used, and they were used concurrently here to show the journey. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so numerology. So numbers show up all the time. They're also symbols, right?
Yes.
They symbolize something in the cosmos. They symbolize something in creation. And that's why we have number 7. That's why we have a number 3. That's why we have the number 4. these represent something more than themselves. Hans, stupid Hans, represents something more than himself. And becoming conscious represents the transformative process in our journey. So everybody who looks back at their journey, they need to know their transformative process. There were a lot of points in time that we did something to help ourselves or to complete a task that we set out. Creation occurs with the formation of the idea. I have an idea. I want to do something. Creation begins. It takes root. Might as well have thrown a seed that's starting to sprout. That is the process. The process of life always is creation. So if you're not creating, something is wrong. If you don't think of it as creation, something is wrong. And that's usually when we're traumatized, when we're stuck, when we can't move out of our rut, when we can't move out of our way, when things come at us instead of toward us. So there's a continuous bombardment out there to the internal. There is no being able to see out and reflect back in. Well, that's how you know. If you could peer out and reflect, then you're free. If you peer out and feel what's going on in your head, then you're not, you're stuck. Because you can't look out. What do you mean I need to go out? I'm fine. You're not. That's how it works. Interesting story, as always.
Yeah.
As always with Van France, she always takes us by surprise. We are going into chapter 3 next week. And as we think of stupid Hans, obviously not so stupid Hans, it should be called, because he turns out not to be that stupid. So, to all of you who have been underestimated, who have been called names, who have been frightened, who have been scared, stupid Hans represents the hero, the one who did what everybody thought was undoable. And that's you out there. So with that, unless my panel has anything to add to the discussion.
That was a great summarizing point, because it is us. Thank you.
So with that, I am Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai. This is the IFC's Individuation podcast. And we are not afraid.
We are not afraid.
We are not afraid.
We are the Institute for Conflict, and we are not afraid. We will see you next week with another episode. Have a good one.